I'm just going to introduce Dr. Rima Majed for us to begin. Dr. Majed is professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies here at AUB. Her work is on social movements, urban politics, sectarianism, mobilization, and a lot more. She has a full bio that is online, and with a list of publications that I very, very much encourage you to go and check, because she has a lot to teach us about how to think Beirut in similar contexts in which politics are influencing enormously cities and the way in which people interact with them. Dr. Majed is no stranger to city debates. She's been with us many times before, so we're really super happy to welcome her with us today and to ask her to please chair and discuss this panel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mona and the whole team. I'm really glad to be back to City Debates. I started many years ago discussing Asif Bayat, and I've been coming back every year to very interesting debates. So I'm honored today to be chairing this panel entitled The New Faces of Statehood. We have three great speakers, and I won't take too much time. I'll just quickly introduce them. I'll introduce each speaker right before they present, and I'll go by the order that I have here. We'll start with Professor Walter Nicholls, who's a professor of urban planning and public policy at the University of California, Irvine. He's also the chair of that same department. His research examines how cities incubate the activism of marginalized groups. He's written extensively, and you can check the full bio, but he has several books about, the first one is entitled The Dreamers, How the Undocumented Youth Movement Transformed the Immigrant Rights Debate. His second book is entitled Cities and Social Movements, Immigrant Rights, and Activism in the United States, France, and the Netherlands. And his most recent book is The Immigrant Rights Movement, The Battle Over National Citizenship. Professor Walter.
Okay, so thank you for the organizers of the conference, Mona. I'd like to also thank the folks who helped coordinate all of this. The student volunteers have been extremely important, organizing the field trips, providing us logistics, walking us here every day. So thank you. So my presentation is on what's called insurgent bureaucrats. So in the previous session, we were talking a little bit about bureaucrats and the importance of bureaucrats in achieving certain types of not only sort of policy change, but also how they engage in politics. So I'm going to be basing my study on the case of a municipality in Southern California. It's a municipality of around 500,000 people. We give this municipality the name we anonymize it and we call it Mayville, but it's not really Mayville. But nevertheless, we look at a process of what we call sort of insurgency. We use the term insurgency not because they're revolutionaries, but it's much more in line with the traditional American-based social movement literature. Which uses insurgents or challengers sort of synonymously as collective actors who mobilize collectively in contentious politics to achieve certain types of goals. So let's start. So in the period of the late 2000s, my colleague and I were studying pro-immigrant. Whoops, that was too fast. We're studying pro-immigrant mobilizations in California. So we're interested in especially mobilizations for what was called sanctuary. So at that period of time, the Trump administration had come into power and was introducing highly repressive deportation measures to deport undocumented migrants. So a lot of cities and a lot of folks in cities started to mobilize to introduce policies called sanctuary policies, and these policies would limit the ability of immigration agencies, immigration police, to work with local municipal police to detain and deport undocumented immigrants within their jurisdictions. So in 2018 we started performing these studies on these types of mobilizations in a variety of cities, and we started to focus on this one city called Mayville. And during this process, we discovered that there are bureaucrats who actually, not only in addition was there a lot of mobilization by activists to change the immigration policies of cities, but we also saw that there were bureaucrats who acted and spoke like social justice advocates. There were sizable networks of these bureaucrats that were working within the state. They had developed an oppositional identity, and they worked collectively to enact certain types of policies alongside traditional social movement actors. So what we start to see is this type of insider-outsider, but not necessarily elected officials, but bureaucrats. These bureaucrats also collaborated with these organizations and elected officials to push not only pro-immigrant policies in the city, but eventually racial equity policies in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. So the question of this project became, how do disparate bureaucrats, individualized bureaucrats working within a city, become an insurgent groups within these types of administrations? No? So it's a fairly simple question. According to sort of much of the literature, bureaucrats don't necessarily act this way. They don't necessarily act as a collective actor engaged in political struggle to achieve collective ends in alliance with social movement organizations. But nevertheless, in our empirical case, we see that this is what's going on. So the second question is, how do insurgent bureaucrats, we call them insurgent bureaucrats, create institutions that embody the ethics, values, and goals of activists? So the literature that we're looking at, on the one hand, the literature from critical urban theory oftentimes takes a Marxist perspective on the state, and it suggests that either the state fulfills capitalist reproductive functions or productive functions, or that the state is an instrument to spur developers through the literature called growth machine. And this literature is interesting and very, very informative about certain types of aspects of how the state operates in cities, but it oftentimes conceptualizes the bureaucrat as sort of a cog in machine, as a sort of a relay of state power, and largely lacking any kind of agency or political will on their own. So what we're interested in is how bureaucrats become contentious and collective actors, and this literature doesn't necessarily provide the tools to address that question. There is a literature in the United States that was very popular called, it was by Michael Lipsky, Conceptualized Street-Level Bureaucrats, and this was a theory in which bureaucrats can actually veer away from capitalist or from the functions or the rules that capitalists or elected officials give them. They're not necessarily just enacting rules that the government instructs them to do, but they have certain types of discretion. They can choose how they actually implement those rules on a case-by-case basis. So rather than bureaucrats becoming just sort of cogs in a machine or relays of the government or relays of the state, they can exercise their discretion to give favor to certain groups and disfavor to other groups. So they're really street-level bureaucrats who really determine how policy is implemented. Understanding how they exercise discretion is important for understanding how actual policy is implemented at the street level. So if we think street-level bureaucrats, we would think of social welfare workers, police, these types of folks. So the good thing about this literature is that it tells us that bureaucrats do have agency. They can act according to distinctive types of norms. The problem with this is that they conceive of bureaucrats as acting individually rather than as a collective and politically engaged actor. So we understand that bureaucrats can be sort of have some degree of autonomy, but they're acting. The theory involved in this particular line of literature suggests that they act as individuals rather than as collectives, and they're also conceived as fairly apolitical. So in this study, in a couple of papers, I've been trying to develop a theory of bureaucrats and bureaucratic insurgency. It's largely based on the cases of case of the United States, the case I know, and the case I'm deriving this literature from. So the paper actually develops a four-pronged theory, and it derives it largely from people like Nicholls, Pierre Bourdieu, Gramsci, Stuart Hall, etc. And the first argument is that local bureaucratic state is relatively autonomous and hierarchical. So it's fairly, and there's degrees of autonomy that can vary from one place to another. When there's elite capture, there's less autonomy, but in a place like in the United States, where you've had a high degree of professionalization, you do have some degree of autonomy, but it's also hierarchical, where where status, resources, authority is divided unequally according to bureaucrats, but also to agencies. And the idea of hierarchy means that there's endemic conflict within bureaucracies. So rather than bureaucrats just being sort of cogs in a machine, as oftentimes they conceive them in the United States, hierarchy breeds conflict between dominant and dominated bureaucrats. And this conflict and competition oftentimes centers over norms of government. What is the public interest? How should the state be used to achieve the public interest? And also over resources. No? So how do we use the state? What is the public interest? What should we do? But also who should get money? Who should get authority? Who should get status within the state? So there's competition between differentially positioned bureaucrats. And oftentimes, according to Pierre Bourdieu, he would argue that that the dominant and dominated oftentimes overlaps with what he called the left hand and the right hand of the state, the right hand being police, finance functions, the left being social service functions. So there's this hierarchical state that's divided according to functions, but also power relationships, and the fact that it's structured this way creates a lot of sort of internal conflict over the state, over how it should be governed, what is the public interest, and who's getting what within that particular field. The third argument that we've been developing is derived from social movement literature, which is that social networks between dominated bureaucrats enable them to support one another, pool resources, and construct a collective oppositional identity. So whereas propositions 1 and 2 identify the structural conditions for internal conflict, it suggests that bureaucrats have distinctive interests that put them in opposition to other actors. Proposition 3 suggests that networks play an important role of connecting people in a dominated position, creating a sense of trust, creating a collective sense of oppositional identity, and creating an agenda to act as a collective actor against their dominant adversaries. And we argue that these networks transform these dominated individuals who are aggrieved into an actual collective actor, an insurgent, or potentially an insurgent subject. And lastly, we argue that crisis can serve as a political opportunity. So we would suggest that there's sort of constant fights. Once you have this type of network, there's constant fights over positioning and power within the bureaucracy. Oftentimes it's slow moving. You're trying to get your friend a job. You're trying to sort of move people up the hierarchy. You're doing small degree of lobbying. But every once in a while, there's a crisis, and these crises create opportunities that destabilize the system, create moments of illegitimacy, which provides an insurgent an opportunity to advance fairly quickly, not necessarily take over the state, but at least move up the state, sort of like a soccer field or a football field. So methods, I'll go over this really quickly. We had created a large newspaper database based on 153 articles, interviewed unelected officials, directors of nonprofit organizations, elected officials, performed observations of government meetings, city council meetings, racial reconciliation meetings, housing meetings. We constructed a yearly budget from 2000 to 2021, so we were able to assess the distribution of money to different agencies to see who's getting what and how much. And this becomes a measure of the hierarchy itself. And we also looked at housing reports, and we were looking at sort of changes of language over time in terms of sort of categories, sort of ethnic and racial categories that are employed. And we also employed an analysis of application forms. And if you're interested, I could tell you why. So in terms of findings, contextual settings of insurgent bureaucrats. So here what we start to see in our case of Mayville is that this city is becoming increasingly diverse from 1980 to 2019, moves from 67% white to 28%, and 14% Latino to 42%, and 5% Asian to 13%. So it radically changes in terms of its ethnic composition over this period of time. And we also see that the city becomes increasingly democratic and progressive over this period of time as well. So in 1990, the vote for Republican and Democrat was almost evenly split. By the time you get to 2018, it's skewed sharply towards Democrats. We also see, by the time we get to 2016, a very progressive city council with 4 members of the city council who identify as democratic socialists. 3 other council members are moderate Democrats, 2 Republicans. And you also see we measured attitudes. So if we could talk about this in the discussion section if you'd like. But we also measure the attitude of different elected officials. Positive one would be a very positive attitude. Negative would be perfectly negative in everything and all the statements stated in the newspapers. So here we see that the attitudes towards by elected officials towards outgroups, particular immigrants, were positive. So we also see, additionally, important coalitions forming at this period of time. So that we see, on the one hand, a political context that's favorable, elected officials that are increasingly progressive, and we also see social movement organizations forming to fight a variety of different types of issues, from wages to sustainability issues, etc. And we also see the formation of an immigrant rights coalition in 2013 that's drawn upon these coalitions within this particular territory. So here, so this sets the context. So we see a context in which it's politically favorable to insurgent bureaucrats, favorable elected officials, favorable electorate, and a social movement organization that's well-resourced, and that works really well to get with one another to advance political causes. So now it's just to focus on the formation of our insurgent bureaucrats. So they're operating already in a favorable organizational and political context, which contributes to the formation of these types of bureaucrats. So in terms of an institutional setting, in 2015, the city introduces a language access program, which is a program to perform translations, in particular in Tagalog, Spanish, and Khmer. So they introduced the language access program. It was a response to immigrant rights activists, and the city provided funding for 1 part-time staff. In 2016, the Office of Equity was created. It was created by a city council member, Rod Riley, and the Director of Health and Human Services. And Health and Human Services really does become the agency that sort of powers a lot of these things forward. And the function of the office was to support equity and diversity within the bureaucracy. They were actually designed to advance equity and diversity issues within the bureaucracy and change the hearts and minds of bureaucrats. This Office of Equity was housed in the Department of Health and Human Services. The city provided 1 staff, 1 director, and the access program was relocated into this office, into the Office of Equity. Now, in terms of hierarchy, so that's a sort of a description of where the institutional location of these insurgent bureaucrats, and they were located at the bottom of the hierarchy, of the Mayville hierarchy. So Office of Equity was located in a dominated department. Health and Human Services, 90% of its revenue came from external grants. So this is sort of a unique situation in which the public sector department, a large department in charge of the health of a fairly large city, 92% of its money came from private philanthropy. So that's not very good. So 2% of the city's total operating budget went to Health and Human Services. So this is an indicator that it receives very little money from the city. Its operations really depend on the private sector. So that's an indicator of sort of the status and the sort of the resources attributed to this group. And the Office of Equity was also resource poor. It was entirely funded by private philanthropy. It had restricted staffing capabilities, and a lot of the labor fell upon committed staff and allies in other departments, most of whom were women of color. So in this situation, we see an under-resourced department supporting an under-resourced agency, and the only way they can maintain the agency is by exploiting the labor of women of color. So this is a dominated position in a dominated department. And here in this context, we start to see a small group of people starting to mobilize, a small group of first movers. The Director of the Health and Human Services, Director of Office of Equity, Director of Language Access. They start to talk to one another. They're already sort of ideologically predisposed to left-wing politics. And then they join this national network called Government Alliance on Racial Equity. and they started to attend trainings, sort of repeated trainings. And this was a national network of cities and elected officials working on racial equity issues, and they provided ideology, language to city-level bureaucrats, and they provided programs and trainings. And so what this did is that it helped construct an insurgent identity. So the director of one of these programs says the focus is really to help governments normalize conversations, learnings, and understandings about racial equity, to organize themselves in a way that they could be mobilized to advance racial equity, and then operationalize it through programs, policies, and practice. So this is sort of an important statement, because on the one hand, there's an issue about constructing that oppositional identity within the state. There's a second question about organizing collectively other like-minded bureaucrats. And the third issue is operationalizing their sort of conceptions and their worldviews into actual government and administrative categories. And they did it. So they organized, they introduced, they created this, an equity toolkit, and this became the organizing tool for other bureaucrats within the Mayville organization. So as they created this, they launched this strategy. There was also an interdepartmental networking. So they connected to not only people in health and human services, expanded outward from there, but also went into urban planning, went into parks and recreation, into libraries. They started to move across the different sectors of the bureaucracy and through this type of interdepartmental networking. So they created what were called, and they did this through what they called racial equity champions. So each person, they designated each person in a department to be a champion, and that person would function to organize and create that kind of oppositional identity within their own departments. So each racial equity champion formed their racial equity committees, and then they would meet, and then they would implement the equity training toolkits. So these became an important way to implement those toolkits, or to implement that process. So, I've run out of time. That's terrible. So there was a crisis, there was mobilizations. I'm gonna have to just walk through this fairly quickly now.
You don't have enough 2 minutes.
Oh, do I? Okay, wonderful. So I have 2 cases. So so we could also talk about this a little bit later, but nevertheless, there were 2 crises, and these crises, what we start to see around 2016, 17, 2000 to 2020, is 2 major crises. One crisis is the election of Donald Trump, and the second big crisis is the murder of George Floyd, which triggers another round of Black Lives Matter's mobilization. So 2 big crises, and these become openings for these actors. So the first political crisis results in this type of spike in mobilization, and there's demands for a sanctuary city campaign, and in this campaign there was great hope that it would pass because it's a progressive city council. Everybody disliked Trump, but eventually the policy fails. So in this, you had high organizational capacity, you had awesome political opportunities, but the mobilization fails. And in this case, in this situation, what we start to see is that the insurgent bureaucrats aligned with these organizations faced asymmetric powers within the bureaucracy itself. And that dominant bureaucrat was the police department, and it had enormous amounts of resources, and enormous amounts of political support from the city council, and enormous amounts of legitimacy. By contrast, and they saw the sanctuary city policy as a threat to its authority, autonomy, and resources, and in response, the Office of Equity entered the policy process with limited experience, resources, and authority, and they lost. They faced an asymmetric power holder within the bureaucratic field. The second crisis turns out to be a little bit more successful. So this is the second crisis right there. And here we start to see the protest claims of defund the police, police unjust and part of the carceral state, police are unaccountable. In this situation, the target is directly the police. And this results in sort of a legitimacy crisis for the police. And it changes this changes the balance of power. Here, in this case, we start to see that there's a decline of legitimacy for the police and an increased legitimacy for insurgent bureaucrats in the Office of Equity. And here again, so there's a decline, a massive hit to the legitimacy of the police. We see an increase of legitimacy for the Office of Equity, and at the same time, by the time you hit 2020, we also see that these bureaucrats had strong networks, they had a coherent agenda, and they also had a lot more experience working the policy process. So they had more resources, more support going into this battle, whereas their adversaries were much weaker because of the nature of this struggle. And the Office of Equity leads policy process and eventually introduces a reconciliation policy, which helps to improve the position for insurgents. They move up into the city manager's office. So in the hierarchy of municipal bureaucracy, they move from the margins of the political field into the center. And they also are able to capture many more resources. They redistribute resources from the police to the Office of Equity and the Department of Health and Human Resources. So there's a redistribution of resources, but there's also a move up in the hierarchy of the bureaucratic field. So that's it. That's my presentation on insurgent bureaucrats. So sorry for going over.
Thank you so much, Walter. This was very, very interesting. I think I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion about also comparisons with public sector employees movement in the Arab world and other places. So we'll move now to our second speaker, Dr. María José Álvarez Rivadulla, who's a full professor of sociology at the Universidad de los Andes. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Where she actually created the sociology area 8 years ago with a minor in sociology and an MA program that she directs. Professor Majo is the author of a book entitled Squatters and the Politics of Marginality, and she's currently working on a new book. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You don't know how excited I am to be here and how my mind has been exploding in many different ways. Getting outside from your region, from your comfort zone, is very important to help you think, relate, learn. So this experience has been humbling, and I thank both Monas and Isabella and Antonia for organizing this and all the other people that have been here. So many connections to Walter and to the other presentations, but we'll have time for that. I just wanted to connect with the title of the seminar, Disrupted Urbanisms. This policy that I want to present to you about is also a disruption, but a disruption in a different sense. It's one of the few positive disruptions that I have studied. I always study segregation and inequalities in the urban and in educational settings. And this policy in Bogota has been inspiring in different ways. So this is a collaborative work that I've been conducting with my colleagues, Frederic and Adriana. How do I pass it? And also with students. We also have not such a famous lab, but a little lab called also Laboratorio Urbano with students and with Adriana and Federica. Adriana is in development and Federica is in anthropology. I'm in sociology. So what I'm going to talk about is about the new system of care in Bogota. This is a policy recently implemented by the past major, the first woman major ever in Colombia. And it was introduced in the pandemic. So that's, it was a disruptive time that allowed perhaps this disruptive policy to happen. The policy aims to foster class and gender equality, especially in the city neglected peripheries, and with this population, those who care, that have been also a neglected population. It's organized around care blocks. These are decentralized social services infrastructures. You are going to see they vary a lot in a minute. And it already earned the policy several international prizes. You know, whenever I say I come from Bogota, people tell me, oh, yes, Medellin, Bogota, the BRT, this is the prize. This is Major Claudia Lopez, and this is the prize they just got in China for the Best Urban Innovation Award. And I'm going to just, in a minute, show you, we tend to be known for innovative policies. This is, Bogota is, you know, I'm not going to teach you about Colombia or anything, but this is a very unequal society, one of the most unequal in the world, and has suffered conflict, internal conflict for many years, and is still suffering conflict even after the peace agreement. But it's also known for, especially the cities, for these innovative policies. Maybe you know more about Medellin, but the BRT bus system has been has received many prizes. Also, the ciclovia, the cycling day on Sundays, where we go, we have the street for bikes, and this has been taken out to cities such as, I don't know, San Francisco or many other cities in Latin America, that they are copying these practices. And also the bus system, instead of a metro, has been copied elsewhere. Also the cable cars and some interventions have been copied in other places. Well, the system of care has already become famous and is being looked at by many other cities. I was at one encounter of Latin American people coming from all over to learn from this policy, which is very recent, right? It's been implemented, and at the same time, people are coming to learn from it. So, our question was for this particular work, under what condition is a policy like this one possible? How can we make it happen? Because the normal Hollywood story is that there was a major and she came and she changed everything, and things tend to be more complicated than that. And when we when we win these prizes, or people or cities win these prizes, then everybody wants to copy them, and realities were different. So we wanted to unearth what were the conditions behind this policy. And we found two very important ones, and we are continuing looking. One is political willingness, and the other one is committed street bureaucrats. And in that way, I connect a lot to what Walter was talking about. So what makes policy innovations a success, especially in weak states, poor states, conflictive states, corrupt states, clientelistic states? What are the reasons behind successful policies in debilitated, poor, or weak states? And trying to look into the literature, we found this book with a really nice title, Good Policies in the Tropics, I think it's the name. Tendler is the author, and she finds five main elements in well-performing governments in poor states, and many of them have to do with street bureaucrats or workers, state workers. So we found many of these conditions that you have there in our case, and I'm going to tell you which ones. So how does the policy work? As I said, the policy addresses caregivers, that is especially women. These blocks of care act as time banks, so and they address the poverty of time of these women. Why? Just in a minute, because let me show you I want to advance everything starts with these statistics about how we use time. And it turns out that women, this is the time we dedicate to things that we're not paid for, to work we're not paid for. And women do about 4 hours more. This is before the pandemic. In the pandemic, it only got worse. And after the pandemic, women on average do at least 4 more hours than men in domestic and paid care work. So everything started there feminist groups started to address this topic. And so when I'm gonna pass this because of time, but when the new major came, the feminists in the city addressed the major and they said, we want this policy, and she agreed. So there's another story there that we are studying now about how this happened, but she said yes. And how did it got implemented? So it got implemented prioritizing certain areas of the city. Those are the care blocks in the city. This area tends to be much more poor, and the criteria for prioritizing were multidimensional poverty, percentage of care workers, dedicated care workers, and paid, and care issues, and that the community had prioritized in some way care issues in their participatory budgeting. So in 4 years, they made 20 of these care blocks, and they planned 45 care blocks. Now there are already 22. So each time we went to the field, there were more and more and more. How do they look like so you can envision them? So as I said, they are time banks. So while you wash your clothes, you can finish high school, and they take care of your kid. So it's like it's a moment in which you, as a caregiver, go to a place, and this is a woman we encounter there, and you can go to swimming classes, and at the same time they take care of your loved ones, being them the elderly. It's easier if you have kids because they have more services for that. You can also do gym. And this woman was there to wash her clothes, and she said she was just resting when I got in there. And she said, I come from a rural area, about an hour and a half walking from here. I come every 15 days to wash her clothes. This is a blessing. Hand washing delays everything, and you get really tired. I would like to go to the swimming pool while I wait for my laundry, but now I can't because my son is in the hospital. He faints, and they don't know what he has. So she was just breathing, there. And this is also what care blocks are for, to breathe. This is the places, I didn't take pictures of the kids, but this is the places where they take care of the kids. And they have education services. The most popular is finishing high school. And you don't know, I tell my students, I wish your notebooks were like these women's, because they have drawings and good handwriting, and they are so enthusiastic about finishing. They have spaces to breathe and self-care, and services for people who need care, and awareness-raising workshops about care, about the value of being a care giver. So we took an ethnographic approach. We also did interviews with the officials, but mainly in the care blocks. We participated in events. Well, I can tell you more about this. This is one event in which they were opening a new care block where, so this project is located in pre-existing infrastructure mainly. So this used to be not a jail, but people call it a jail. It's the neighborhood people. It's a place in which they put people for a while until they get judged. So people in the neighborhood call it a jail. And they put a block of care here. And here is the major inaugurating this, and it was like a political act. It was a very interesting space to see her act as a politician, and her willingness was very important. She said yes, and she also said, I'm gonna do this in the pandemic, and I'm gonna do this with the existing infrastructure, and I would make people in different departments talk to each other for the first time, like the health person and the education person. They're gonna have to respond and give services in one unique place, disrupting the logics of state bureaucratization and division. So she also valued she also emphasized the value of learning by doing, like we're gonna do this no matter what in very little time. And she said equality is unstoppable, but it cannot be on paper. It cannot be about rights that there are in the Constitution, but not in life, in the law, but not in the home. We need women's right to be in life, in the street, in the home. That is why the care system and the care blocks are going to stay. They're going to grow. With time, they're going to have more and better services, but you can never improve what you don't start. So this idea of progressive, incremental, that I'm going to show you in a minute how it worked. For example, in places where there was nothing, there was not, you saw the people doing gym there. This infrastructure she didn't build. I mean, this was there. Let me show you. This was there. There were already gym classes, but they were not targeted to caregivers. So what she did was, what is there, and look what is there, and take it to this specific population. And in some cases, they created things. Where in places where Bogotá is huge, it has 9 million people. So in places where there was no infrastructure, she said, let's take a bus. And so there are care blocks in buses that are mobile for now, and then we'll see if we get the money. Care blocks were adjusted to different services in different neighborhoods in strange ways. This is the most interesting one. This used to be a brothel in a red zone of the city, and they transformed it. And now there you have, for instance, a all night functioning daycare, night care for babies and things like that. So they reshaped the meaning of this place in the neighborhood, and they did it there. But that was not enough. So political willingness of the mayor was very important. We are currently analyzing the political opportunities and conditions for this to happen. It's not only that she was a woman. It's not only that the feminist movement was in action. We're unearthing also the conditions of possibility for this political decision. But another condition of possibility are the street bureaucrats that Walter was also highlighting. So I'm gonna pass over this and show you this. Each care block has one coordinator. And these women, we went to all of them working at the moment. And these women were amazing. They were all the time working, all the time connecting. They have 200 WhatsApp groups active, and not exaggerating, 200 WhatsApp groups each, to which they sent all the information. They are all the time knitting the state, making the state work and taking the state to the citizen, which is something these women are not used to. They distrust the state. And so we saw them work. They have this is, I put her name because she's a public figure in TikTok, and in TikTok she calls these women to come, and she performs. And so we could observe her during fieldwork in action, doing tours, listening to people, changing the schedules of classes so they could fit the schedules of the women. We see them, this is another coordinator, this woman here. I was doing an ethnography. She didn't know I was there because we didn't know each other yet. And I just waited there for an hour and saw her work. And it was amazing. On the phone, directly with the women, and she makes them repeat, all services are free of charge. Repeat, they are? And the women answer, free, yes, they are free. And she explains what care is. Her name is Winnie. I think I have another picture of her showing these women in a workshop how men do maybe the coffee in the morning, and they take garbage out, but the women do care work all the time. So, I mean, these women are amazing, and you cannot explain that without some mobilization, let's say, or some spirit of commitment with the program. We also read this book that Walter mentioned, because it's very important to tell you the discretion and agency that bureaucrats can have when they are providing or not providing a service. But there's more than that. There's the mythical part of feminism. Many of them come from the feminist movement, many of them will tell them, these women are my grandma, are my mom, and they are finishing high school, and that's very important. So they are very committed to this. At the same time, they don't have a labor contract because most of Colombian neoliberal state is based on short-term contracts. So they are not really state workers. They have a contract with the state. So when we do committed research with them, with the users, with the state, and we said, be careful, these women are gonna burn out. And what's gonna happen with this mythical moment fades away. So they're aware, they listen to us, and we're trying to improve the policy, helping them. This is not only academic research, but what I want to conclude by giving you these two preconditions, at least, for a policy like this to work. First, well, the policy is promising, but a policy is not a blueprint you can, or a best practice, I hate the best practices brand, that you can simply insert in one place or the other. You have to be very careful about the context in which you apply this policy. And because life is complicated, I got called by this project to study good practices of urban change, and I'm making their story much more complicated. They are very willing to learn, but this is a project in which we are now with Federica and Adriana, with the Urban Lab, trying to learn from different cities in the south. Well, if Belfast is in the south, it's a question, but let's say yes. Belo Horizonte and Bogota, we're meeting in 2 weeks in Bogota. And the idea is to learn with civil society actors. It's a participatory project. And the idea is for us to learn from each other, but also from the US, which is funding this Foundation for Sustainable Cities, Robert Wood, I should know this, Robert Wood, the funder. I should thank them, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, or not. And so the idea is to learn from each other and to learn from complicated stories, not from simple stories. And now we're complicating the story a little bit more, looking at these feminists that were very important in bringing the policy to the eyes of the public and bringing gender issues to the eyes of the public, and that continue working to improve this policy and many other issues, because some of them are very critical and say, well, this is part of it, but not all women issues are care issues. So we need to improve what the local government does for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, María José. This was really very, very stimulating.